If you had walked through Willow Creek on an early spring morning, you would have thought the town had been frozen in a gentler time. The old bakery still opened at 5 a.m. The barber shop still smelled like cedar oil, and the streets carried the kind of quiet that made you believe bad things only happened somewhere else. And somewhere above a small flower shop on Maple Street, wedged between a hardware store and a thrift boutique, lived a young woman everyone in town seemed to know, even if only in passing. Her name was Mai Anderson. Mai was 22, soft-spoken, and so gentle that even the elderly widows at the nursing home joked she must have been born with a halo. She worked part-time as a barista at Brewed Awakening, the cozy little cafe where regulars never had to say their order out loud, because Mai remembered every one of them. She greeted people with warm smiles, left handwritten notes on coffee cup sleeves, and paid attention to the small things, birthdays, anniversaries, the day someone's dog passed away. She didn't do it to be liked. It was just who she was. Her life was simple, almost beautifully so. After her shifts, she'd walk home through the back alley to feed stray cats she had secretly named Pumpkin, Shadow, and Miss June. She spent Friday nights reading poetry on her balcony, wrapped in a second-hand sweater and sipping cheap tea. On Sundays, she volunteered at the nursing home, reading Mary Oliver and Langston Hughes to residents who swore her voice made their bones hurt less. People in Willow Creek didn't call her an angel as a figure of speech. They meant it. But like every quiet soul, Mai carried a loneliness she never talked about. She wasn't lonely for company. She had friends, co-workers, neighbors who adored her. What she longed for was something deeper, something she had always believed in, a love that felt handwritten, honest, fragile in a beautiful way. She dreamed of the kind of relationship where people danced in the kitchen barefoot, wrote letters instead of texts, and stayed because trust mattered more than anything else. Mai believed in that kind of love the way other people believed in religion. And that belief, as pure as it was, also made her vulnerable. People often said Willow Creek was a safe town, but safety can make innocence feel invincible. It can teach kind souls to overlook red flags because things like that don't happen here. Mai grew up absorbing the idea that most people meant well, that trusting someone wasn't a risk, it was a virtue. She saw the good in everyone long before she ever considered the possibility of the opposite. Her best friend Nina would sometimes tease her about it. Mai, you're the kind of girl who'd give away your umbrella in a thunderstorm and then apologize for getting wet, Nina once said, laughing. Mai only blushed. Well, maybe they needed it more. That was just who she was. Kindness first, questions later. From her upstairs window, Mai could see most of Maple Street. The world below looked predictable, safe, almost scripted. She believed that if she kept being good, kept loving gently, kept seeing the best in people, life would eventually be kind back. It was a quiet hope she never said aloud, but it lived in everything she did. And for a long time, it seemed to be enough. But innocence and kindness, when left unprotected, can be the softest targets. Sometimes the people who shine the brightest are the ones the darkness reaches for first. Mai had no way of knowing that her life, ordinary, peaceful, full of soft routines and small joys, was about to collide with something she had never been prepared for. Something that would take that gentle heart of hers and twist it into shapes she didn't recognize. In the spring of that year, as Willow Creek prepared for its annual poetry night, Mai brewed coffee behind the counter, humming softly to an old love song. She didn't realize that in just a few hours, a man would walk into the cafe, tall, brooding, carrying the kind of sadness that looked like depth from far away, and her life would begin to unravel. She didn't know yet that trusting him would cost her everything. He walked into the Brewed Awakening on a Thursday night, the kind of night when the cafe lights glowed amber and the open mic crowd leaned back in their chairs, pretending they understood the poetry more than they actually did. Mai was behind the counter wiping down the espresso machine when the door chimed and a stranger stepped in, bringing a gust of cold air and something heavier, something unspoken behind him. He didn't look like Willow Creek. He didn't look like he belonged to any town at all. His name, she would learn later, was Kevin Hartley. 28. Musician. Drifter. A man who carried the kind of presence that made people curious before they felt afraid. He was tall, lean, dressed in a worn leather jacket with creases like scars. His hair was messy in a way that looked intentional, and his eyes, dark, restless, seemed to roam the room like they were searching for a reason to stay. When he stepped up to the stage for open mic night, nobody knew what to expect. His poem wasn't particularly good. It was vague, moody, abstract in all the ways amateur poems often are. But when he lifted his gaze from the paper, he looked directly at Mai, as if the crowded cafe had blurred away and she was the only one left in the room. And Mai, who rarely looked at anyone for too long, felt her breath hitch. Kevin came back the next night, and the night after that. Sometimes he ordered a black coffee he barely drank. Sometimes he sat in the back corner, scribbling into a notebook. But every time I walked past, he watched her with that unreadable expression, part fascination, part melancholy, part something she couldn't name. He carried himself with a quiet intensity, like a man with chapters he'd never let anyone read. When he finally spoke to her, leaning on the counter at closing time, his voice was low, a little rough, like someone who smoked too much and slept too little. "You listen better than most people," he said without looking up. Mai blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "You're not pretending. Most people pretend." He had a way of talking that made everyday things sound profound. Not because he was wise, but because he was wounded, and wounded people often mistake their pain for depth. To Mai, who had spent her life being gentle and steady, Kevin's darkness felt like gravity pulling her closer. He told her pieces of his story, in fragments, never the whole thing. That he had drifted from city to city. That music was all he had left. That Willow Creek felt quiet enough to breathe in. He never mentioned the parts that mattered. The self-destruction, the burned bridges, the storms he created in every life he entered. He had learned long ago that vulnerability could be weaponized. Within a week, Kevin was waiting for her after every shift, leaning against a lamppost with a cigarette in hand. He talked about art, chaos, loneliness, things Mai had only read about in books. His sadness didn't scare her. It awakened the part of her that wanted to nurture, soothe, mend. It made her believe she could be the person who finally understood him. Nina rolled her eyes the first time she saw him. "He's cute, but he's trouble, Mai." Mai smiled the way naive people often do when they think their hearts know a secret no one else does. "He's just misunderstood." But Kevin wasn't misunderstood. He was unreadable on purpose. He knew exactly what he was doing, showing just enough vulnerability to seem deep, hiding just enough truth to seem safe. And Mai, with her open heart and soft voice, was exactly the kind of girl who filled the emptiness inside men like him. 2 weeks later, he kissed her behind the cafe after closing. 3 weeks later, he told her she made him feel alive again. 4 weeks later, he said Willow Creek wasn't home, but she could be. The pace terrified her, but in the way a first roller coaster ride terrifies you. Thrilling, dizzying, addictive. And then, nearly out of nowhere, Kevin asked her to move in. Nina tried to talk her out of it. "Mai, you barely know this guy. People in Willow Creek don't change that fast. Something about him feels off." But Mai, full of faith and softness and the belief that love meant choosing someone even when the world doubted them, ignored every warning. She packed her things, the poetry books, the old sweaters, the little lamp shaped like a sunflower, and moved into Kevin's dim, cluttered apartment above a pawn shop. She thought she was stepping into love. She didn't know she was stepping into a story she would never be able to escape. Because Kevin Hartley wasn't just a troubled artist. He was a fuse, burning quietly, steadily, leading Mai toward an explosion that would shatter everything she believed about trust, loyalty, and humanity itself. The first few weeks living with Kevin felt like the beginning of the love story Mai had always imagined. She cooked dinner while he strummed his guitar on the couch, and for a moment she believed she had found something real, something worth the leap she had taken. But like all illusions, the cracks showed slowly at first, then all at once. It started with exhaustion. Mai blamed it on the long hours at the cafe at first, but even on days off, she felt like her bones were made of sand. She woke up drenched in sweat, trembling, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. She brushed it off. Maybe the weather, maybe stress, maybe she was just adjusting to a new routine. But soon, people around her noticed changes she couldn't ignore. Nina pointed it out one afternoon as I tied her apron. "Sweetie, you okay? You look like you haven't slept in days." I forced a small smile. "Just tired. Kevin's been writing late. I guess I'm not used to it yet." But the truth was uglier. I wasn't sleeping because she couldn't. Her body felt foreign. Her nights were filled with fevers, chills, and a crushing heaviness in her chest. She had stopped eating without realizing it, barely managing a cup of tea before her stomach knotted in pain. The mirror became something she avoided, her cheeks hollowed, her collarbones more pronounced, her eyes dull and shadowed. Kevin barely noticed, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. When I told him she felt sick, he shrugged from the couch, strumming the same 3 chords over and over. "You're fine. You overthink everything. Just relax. Relax." As if her body wasn't screaming for help. She wore long sleeves, even in the hottest part of summer, because bruises, strange, unexplained bruises, kept appearing on her arms. She told people she bumped into counters. She told herself it wasn't serious. Her once luminous skin lost its warmth, turning pale and almost gray under certain lights. Behind closed doors, she cried quietly into her pillow so Kevin wouldn't hear. Friends tried to check in, but I pulled away without meaning to. She was too tired, too embarrassed, too confused. And Kevin, he became increasingly distant. He spent nights out, came home smelling like cigarettes and city streets. And whenever she asked if everything was okay, he dismissed her with that cold, indifferent tone she was only just beginning to recognize. One day at work, while refilling the pastry case, I felt the room tilt. The lights blurred, the floor wobbled, and before she could call Nina's name, her body crumpled to the ground. She woke to the sound of sirens and Nina's panicked voice calling her name. At the hospital, doctors ran test after test. Blood work, scans, fluids, questions she barely had the strength to answer. She drifted in and out of consciousness as nurses whispered outside her curtain. Finally, late in the evening, 2 doctors stepped inside. Their expressions were too calm, too careful, like people preparing to deliver news that would break something inside her. One of them said gently, pulling a chair beside her bed, "We found what's causing your symptoms." She braced herself. "Cancer? Autoimmune disease? Something rare?" The doctor exhaled slowly. "I'm very sorry, but you've tested positive for HIV." The world didn't just pause, it collapsed. I stared at them, frozen, unable to process the words. "No," she whispered. "No, that's impossible. I've only been with one person. Just one." They asked if she wanted to call someone. She shook her head and stared at the wall, numb. The questions swirled violently. How? When? Why? What did this mean? The room felt too small, too loud, too bright. Hours later, she left the hospital with a packet of information she couldn't read and pills she couldn't swallow. She didn't go home. She didn't even call Nina. She walked until her legs trembled beneath her, until she found herself standing in front of the old brick building where Kevin lived. She climbed the stairs with shaking hands, unlocked the door, and found him sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly flicking guitar strings like nothing in the world was wrong. "Kevin," she whispered. "Yeah," he answered without looking up. "I tested positive." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then he laughed. A short, cruel, bitter laugh. Mai's vision blurred. "Why are you laughing?" "Kevin, why?" He set the guitar aside, leaned back, and looked her dead in the eyes with a coldness she had never seen before. "You think I didn't know?" he said. "I've been positive for years." Mai's knees nearly gave out. "WH what? Why didn't you?" "You didn't ask," Kevin said with a shrug. "And don't act like a victim now. No one forced you to stay." Those words pierced deeper than any diagnosis ever could. Something inside her cracked, quietly, cleanly, like the final snap of a bone you never realized was already broken. She left the apartment without another thought, without another question, without another breath to waste on him. And that night, as she wandered the empty streets of Willow Creek, something else began to grow inside her. Not fear, not sadness, something darker, something far more dangerous, something that, soon enough, would swallow my Anderson whole. I didn't remember how long she walked that night, only that her feet kept moving long after her mind stopped. The air was cold, sharp, almost metallic as it entered her lungs. She didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything. The buildings along Willow Creek blurred into one long smear of shadow and streetlights. The voices of passing strangers faded into static. The world, for the first time in her life, felt unreal. By the time she stopped, she stood in front of a rundown roadside motel on the edge of town. The kind of place people use for affairs, drug deals, or simply disappearing from their own lives for a little while. A neon sign sputtered above her like it was dying too. She walked inside, handed over whatever cash she had, and took a key without meeting the clerk's eyes. Room 12. A single bed, yellowed curtains, a buzzing light, stale air that tasted like smoke and mildew. I closed the door and dropped to her knees. The hospital papers fell from her hands and scattered across the stained carpet. Words like antibodies, viral load, treatment plans staring back at her with cruel clinical indifference. She pressed both hands to her face, but the tears didn't come. It was as if some part of her already knew crying wouldn't fix anything. She climbed onto the bed and curled into herself. Alone, silent, breathless. And that was how the first night passed. On day 2, she couldn't eat. Her body rejected even sips of water. Her head throbbed, her skin burned, and every sound felt like it came from underwater. She slept for long stretches, waking only to stare blankly at the ceiling. Time lost its shape. Morning, evening, midnight, none of it mattered. She turned her phone face down and let it die. By day 4, the loneliness turned into something heavier, shame. A shame so deep it suffocated her. She replayed Kevin's laughter over and over in her mind, his voice cold and casual. Don't act like a victim. Those words dug into her ribs like claws. They echoed louder than the doctor's diagnosis, louder than her heartbeat. She stopped leaving the bed. She stopped showering. She stopped trying to understand anything. Days 6 and 7 were the darkest. She sat by the mirror, studying herself like she was looking at a stranger. She touched her hollow cheeks, traced the dark circles under her eyes, and whispered, "What did he do to me? What have I become?" She pressed her palms to her chest, as if trying to feel her heart, to make sure it was still there. That was when the anger began. Not the kind that explodes. The kind that grows slowly, quietly, like a bruise blooming beneath the skin. Anger at Kevin. Anger at herself for trusting him. Anger at a world that let him walk through life breaking people without consequences. On day 8, she clawed through her bag and found her leather journal. The one filled with poems, softness, dreams. She flipped to a blank page, held the pen for a long moment, then wrote the first sentence since the hospital. He didn't kill me, so maybe I'm supposed to do something with this. The pen shook in her hand. The words didn't even feel like hers, but they stayed. On day 10, something shifted. She stood in front of the mirror again, but this time she didn't study her pain. She studied her reflection with a cold, detached curiosity, like she was trying to erase everything that made her my Anderson. She picked up the motel scissors. Snip, snip, snip. Her long soft hair fell into the sink, piece by piece, until the girl staring back at her looked sharper, harder, stripped of innocence. Then came the dye she bought from a convenience store down the street. Deep auburn red. Bold. Unfamiliar. Untouchable. The transformation wasn't just external. As the red washed down the drain, something else washed away too. The version of Mai who waited for people to choose her. The Mai who loved gently. The Mai who believed empathy could fix broken men. On day 12, she threw out every piece of clothing she had arrived with. Her old phone, cracked, full of messages from people who cared, she powered it off and left it in the motel trash. Her journal, once filled with flowers and metaphors, she ripped out every soft page, leaving only the hard, empty ones. On day 13, she checked out. Not as Mai Anderson. The name she chose at the front desk came easily, like it had been waiting for her. Lynn Taylor. Lynn didn't read poetry. Lynn didn't trust anyone. Lynn didn't cry in the dark. Lynn didn't love. Lynn was sharp, intentional, and unbreakable. She was born out of betrayal, built from pain, fueled by something that no longer resembled fear or innocence. Maya had died quietly in room 12, and from her ashes, Lynn Taylor stepped into the world, not to survive it, but to make sure it remembered her. Lynn's rebirth wasn't loud or dramatic. She didn't storm out of Willow Creek with fire in her veins or vengeance on her lips. She left quietly, like a shadow walking away from the body it once belonged to. But what she carried with her was far louder than any scream, a conviction that the world had taken something from her, and she would take something back. Her first stop was a budget hotel in St. Louis. She paid in cash, checked in under a name she made up on the spot, and bought a prepaid phone from a gas station. She cut the tag off a fitted black dress and slipped into it like armor. That night, she walked into a dimly lit bar and sat alone at the counter, her new red hair cascading over her shoulders. She didn't smile. She didn't flirt. She didn't need to. A man approached, middle-aged, slightly drunk, wedding rings spinning on his finger. He bought her a drink. She let him. He asked if she was from out of town. She said yes, but offered nothing else. Men loved mystery more than honesty, and Lynn used that like a blade. He became victim number one. When it ended, there was no guilt, no trembling hands, no regret, only silence and a strange, quiet sense of power. For the first time since Kevin's laughter broke her, Lynn felt in control. It didn't happen overnight, but a pattern formed. She moved from city to city: Bloomington, Kansas City, Louisville, Evansville, Indianapolis. Never staying longer than a week. Never using the same name twice. She learned which bars attracted lonely men, which hotels didn't ask questions, which lies were most effective, which smiles worked best. And every time she walked away, she wrote in it. The black leather notebook she'd purchased on day 14, freshly reborn. Name, city, date, note. At first the entries were short and almost clinical. 1. Daniel, St. Louis, divorced. 2. Carter, Kansas City, ring 10 missing, lying about marriage. 3. Leo, Bloomington, calls his wife the warden. But as the list grew, the notes darkened. 7. Owen, Memphis, lied about kids. 9. Marcus, Louisville, cries during sex. 12. Troy, St. Louis, brags he's faithful except when traveling. By the time she reached her 15th entry, Lynn no longer cared whether the men were good or bad, lonely or cruel, faithful or unfaithful. The moral lines blurred faster than she could recognize them. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was addiction, a hunger, a way to feel something when life had hollowed her out. The notebook became the only honest thing she owned. Her confession, her map, her legacy. But something shifted around victim number 18, a truck driver named Ethan who'd recently lost his wife. He wasn't flirtatious or arrogant. He was kind, too kind. He apologized when he bumped into her chair. He asked if she'd eaten dinner. He talked about grief with a raw honesty that made her chest tighten. For a moment, Lynn hesitated. For a moment, she felt my inside her stir. Aching, terrified, whispering, "Stop. Not this one. Not him." But hesitation was weakness. And weakness belonged to a girl who no longer existed. Ethan became victim number 18. She wrote about him more than any other man. 18. Ethan, Cincinnati, deserves better. But I can't afford to feel that. Feeling is the thing that kills you. After that, Lynn became more calculated than ever. She learned how to avoid cameras, how to slip past people's suspicions, how to erase footprints. She grew colder, quieter, more dangerous. The tally climbed. 20, 22, 25, 29 men in total. Some married, some single, some kind, some monstrous, some merely lonely. Each one reduced to ink on a page. But Lynn wasn't careless. She sanitized everything she touched. She switched burner phones every few days. She used cash only. She left town before any man had the chance to realize something was wrong. She didn't follow up. She didn't wonder. She didn't care. But the notebook, that was the one thing she kept. Tucked in her bag, wrapped in a scarf, guarded like a relic. Because in a world that had once erased her, that notebook was proof she existed. Proof she mattered. Proof she could hurt the world back. And yet, buried in its final pages was a sliver of truth Lynn refused to face. This wasn't about Kevin anymore. The men she chose weren't him. They weren't even people to her. They were symbols, targets, echoes she wanted to silence. And she didn't know it yet, but that notebook, the one thing she refused to abandon, would soon become the very thing that destroyed her. It was the first thread detectives would pull, and once they started pulling, everything would unravel. Mark Davison never considered himself the kind of man who would be dragged into a nightmare. He was dependable to a fault. 43 years old, an insurance broker from Peoria, Illinois, married for 17 years, father of 2, and the type of man who ironed his shirts the night before work. His co-workers joked that he lived life like a spreadsheet. Organized, predictable, safe. But on a chilly January night in Indianapolis, Mark made one mistake. One small, selfish, human mistake that would unravel his world like thread catching on a nail. Her name, at least the one she gave him, was Ree. Red hair, dark eyes, a quiet voice that somehow felt louder than the music in the hotel bar. She didn't flirt. She didn't perform. She simply existed in this haunting, magnetic way that made Mark forget he was supposed to be someone else. A husband, a father, a man who knew better. They spent one night together. She left before sunrise. He told himself it was nothing, deleted her number, blocked the text thread, and promised God, himself, and the universe that he would move on. Then came the symptoms. Night sweats, a fever he couldn't shake, lymph nodes swollen like pebbles under the skin. His doctor ordered blood work. 2 days later, Mark sat in the exam room, staring at 3 letters that cracked his reality open. HIV positive. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His doctor gently placed a hand on his shoulder and asked if there was anyone he wanted to call. Mark shook his head. There was no one he could call. He'd only been with 2 people in the last decade, his wife and Ree, and he knew which one was responsible. At first, shame kept him silent. He Googled everything he could find. Window periods, false positives, acute symptoms. He prayed it was a mistake. But every road led back to that night, the one he wished he'd never taken. For a week he said nothing, not even his doctor. But guilt chewed at him like acid. And something else did, too. Curiosity. Who was she? What was she? How many men had she done this to? He went back through the deleted messages. Recovered fragments. A burner number. A vague comment about passing through. It wasn't much. But Mark wasn't the type to accept loose ends. He texted 2 friends who'd also been at the conference. Half joking, half terrified, he asked, "Did either of you meet a redhead at the bar that night?" Name Ree. One of them did. Dan Kruger, 45, divorced salesman, admitted, very quietly, that he had gone upstairs with her too. And lately, he hadn't been feeling well either. Dan got tested. Dan was positive. That was the moment Mark's fear turned into purpose. He hired a private investigator, a former cop named Logan Pierce. Logan didn't blink at Mark's confession. He'd heard worse. But what intrigued him was the pattern, the anonymity, the red hair, the sudden disappearance. This wasn't random, Logan said. Someone like her, she's done this before. For 3 weeks, Logan dug. He traced the number to a prepaid phone purchased near St. Louis. He pulled hotel security footage, ATM snapshots, traffic cams. The pieces didn't fit neatly, but the pattern whispered the same name over and over. My Parker, known now by her alias Lynn Taylor. A girl who had once lived a quiet life in Willow Creek. A girl who vanished for 13 days after an HIV diagnosis. A girl with no job, no social media, no address. A ghost. Mark brought everything to the police. And suddenly, his private catastrophe became something much larger. Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri quietly opened a joint investigation. The case was too big for one department. Too messy. Too interstate. Too dangerous. They formed a task force. Operation Crimson. named after the red hair they'd been chasing across half the Midwest. Detectives from 3 states gathered in a room lined with maps, hotel receipts, burner phone records, and grainy surveillance images of a woman slipping through cities like smoke. The pattern was chaotic but intentional. Second-tier cities, low-profile motels, cash payments, quick exits. This wasn't impulse. This was a system. Within weeks, 9 men had come forward with nearly identical stories. A red-haired woman. One night. No last name. Gone before morning. Some were single. Some were married. Some had already passed the virus to their wives. Detective Lydia Monroe, the lead on Operation Crimson, said it best. She didn't just spread a virus. She spread destruction. Quiet, controlled, deliberate. But the breakthrough came from someone no one expected. A maintenance worker in Cincinnati who recognized the sketch the task force released privately between departments. I saw her, he said. Red hair, long coat, walked like she didn't care who saw her. That tip unlocked security footage from a condo lobby. Clear enough. Matching enough. Identical bag. Identical walk. For the first time, they had visual confirmation. A warrant was issued for my Parker, also known as Lynn Taylor, suspected of intentional HIV transmission, aggravated assault, and identity fraud. But Lynn didn't know any of that. She was still moving, still hunting, still believing she was untouchable. Operation Crimson was just beginning, but her time outside was running out. Lynn Taylor was caught at 5:42 a.m. on a cold gray morning that looked exactly like every morning she had slipped through before. The Greyhound station outside Louisville was half asleep. Travelers hunched over plastic seats, the vending machine humming, the fluorescent lights flickering like they were exhausted too. Lynn wore an oversized hoodie, sunglasses, and carried a small black suitcase. The same suitcase captured in half a dozen grainy hotel videos across 3 states. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived this long by blending into the noise. What she didn't know was that Operation Crimson had been waiting for her for days. 2 detectives stood near the vending machine arguing loudly over a styrofoam cup of coffee, an act. A third sat on a bench pretending to read USA Today while watching everyone who approached the boarding gate. As soon as Lynn handed over her ticket, under the alias Emily Hart, one detective gave a tiny nod. My Parker, Louisville PD. You're under arrest. Lynn didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply exhaled, like someone who had known this moment was coming and had already made her peace with it. The arrest was quiet, clean, almost surgical. Within minutes, she was escorted out the back door and placed in an unmarked car. No cameras. No crowds, just the end of a 2-year trail of destruction. But the silence didn't last long. The interrogation room was small, windowless, lit with a buzzing fluorescent that made the concrete walls look even colder. Lynn sat with her hands cuffed in front of her, her red hair grown out and dulled to a muddy brown at the roots. She looked less like a femme fatale and more like a tired student who hadn't slept in days. Detective Lydia Monroe, the woman who had spent 8 months chasing her across 3 states, placed the black notebook on the table. You know what this is, don't you? Lynn didn't blink. That's mine, she said, almost proud. Inside were 29 entries. Names, cities, dates. A short, chilling comment after each one. Number 14, didn't ask questions. Too easy. Number 22, wanted love. Found me instead. Number 24, Ethan. Kind, dangerous to remember. And on the very last page, one sentence that turned the case from tragic to monstrous. I didn't do it for revenge anymore. I did it because I could. Detective Monroe closed the notebook. You understand what this means? You understand what you've done? Lynn didn't look shaken. She didn't look scared. She looked empty. People hurt me first, she said. After a while, hurting back felt like breathing. The moment news leaked, the country ignited. A young woman infecting 29 men across 4 states. A black notebook documenting each one like a trophy list. A quiet barista turned predator. True crime shows exploded overnight. Morning talk shows debated whether she was mentally ill, vengeful, or purely evil. Parents warned their sons about girls like her. Social media split into factions. Hashtag justice for the victims. Hashtag she was a broken girl. Hashtag Scarlet Widow, the nickname that stuck. Several victims came forward publicly, some angry, some devastated, some too ashamed to show their faces. One man admitted his wife had contracted HIV from him. Another lost his job after his diagnosis leaked. One attempted suicide and survived only because a neighbor found him in time. And every road led back to Lynn Taylor, the quiet girl from Willow Creek, the ghost who left no trace, the woman who decided the world had ignored her long enough. The courthouse was overflowing on the first day. Reporters packed the steps. Victims sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. Curious spectators lined up around the block just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had shaken half the Midwest. Lynn entered wearing a beige jumpsuit, wrists chained, hair tied back. She didn't smile. She didn't look around. She stared straight ahead. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like someone who had already checked out of her own story. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating predator who weaponized trust, intimacy, and anonymity. They held up a notebook. They pointed to the 29 entries. They quoted the last page. They called it a roadmap of devastation. Victims testified, 17 of them. Men in suits with trembling voices. A firefighter who lost custody of his kids because of public stigma. A married man who admitted he ruined his wife's life trying to hide his guilt. One man had to pause twice to control his sobbing. Meanwhile, Lynn sat motionless, never wiping a tear, never whispering to her attorney. Her defense argued she was traumatized, broken, mentally shattered by Kevin Hartley, the man who infected her, who laughed in her face when she told him, who walked away without consequence. They argued she never received counseling, never received support, never received compassion. But trauma, the prosecution insisted, does not excuse mass harm. On the final day, Lynn took the stand. Everyone leaned forward. She didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't ask for sympathy. Her voice was quiet, but every word hit like a hammer. I stopped caring. When you stop caring, hurting people isn't a choice. It's natural. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. Reporters scribbled furiously. That single sentence sealed her fate. Guilty on all 29 counts of intentional HIV transmission, aggravated assault, identity fraud, and malicious harm. The sentence: 117 years in prison. No parole, no leniency, no second chances. Some victims cheered. Some cried. Others simply stared, unsure whether they felt justice or hollow relief. Lynn didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't react at all. It was as if the moment she became Lynn Taylor, the girl name might already died. The trial was over, but the storm she unleashed had only just begun. The Women's Correctional Facility in Southern Ohio was a place designed to break noise, break movement, break hope. Gray walls, gray halls, gray uniforms. Everything muted, everything stripped of color, almost as if the system wanted to erase the person inside before time ever could. And somewhere in a long row of identical cells, Lynn Taylor, born my Parker, served a sentence that would outlive her body. She entered the prison the same way she had walked into the courtroom, quiet, unreadable, a ghost of a woman whose story the entire country had already turned into a spectacle. The other inmates stared, whispered, pointed. Some feared her. Others admired her in a strange, unsettling way. A few called her by the nickname plastered all over the news, Scarlet Widow. Lynn never reacted. She never corrected them. She simply existed. Her days followed a rigid schedule. Wake at dawn. Count. Breakfast. Work detail. Count again. Therapy session. Another count. Lights out. Time melted into routine, each hour identical to the last, until even pain began to feel predictable. But the nights were different. Inmates called it the hour of ghosts. Around 3 a.m., when the hall was silent, when the fluorescent lights hummed just loud enough to remind you that sleep wasn't coming. That was when memories crept through the cracks. And for Lynn, they came with a force she couldn't shut out. Some nights, she saw Ethan, the only man she'd ever hesitated for. The one she could have loved if love hadn't become a luxury she no longer trusted. She remembered the way he looked at her, not like prey, not like a fantasy, but like a person, a tired soul recognizing another tired soul. In her notebook, his entry was the only one written with a shaking hand. Number 24. Ethan didn't deserve it. Almost made me believe I was still human. So I had to prove I wasn't. Some nights, she saw Michelle, the woman she never met, but who carried the worst scars of Lynn's choices. Job lost, marriage destroyed, reputation shattered. Lynn didn't know Michelle personally, but she knew women like her, quiet, steady, trusting. Women who paid the price for someone else's mistakes. And some nights, she saw herself. Not the woman the world feared, not the red-haired phantom written about in headlines, but the girl from Willow Creek. The one who fed stray cats and read poetry aloud to elderly residents. The one who believed love was sacred and trust was something you honored, not weaponized. That girl haunted her the most. 3 years into her sentence, Lynn agreed, unexpectedly, to a one-on-one interview with an independent journalist. No camera crews, no networks, just two women sitting in a small visitation room under flickering lights. The journalist asked gently, "Why did you say yes?" Lynn smiled, an almost human expression. "Because I wanted to see what someone looks like when they sit across from me without already deciding who I am." Throughout the conversation, Lynn spoke in sharp, measured sentences, not defensive, not apologetic, just painfully honest. She admitted she remembered every man she infected, every name, every hotel room, every scent of cologne. But she said the worst weren't the cruel ones. They were the kind ones. The ones who meant well hurt the most when I walked away, she whispered. When asked about remorse, she didn't answer at first. She stared at the wall behind the journalist, eyes fixed on something only she could see. Finally, she said, "I feel tired." "Tired of what?" the journalist asked. "Of being blamed for starting a fire when all I did was burn what was already soaked in gasoline." That line would never make it into any article, because the journalist never published the interview. She said she couldn't explain why, but something in Lynn's eyes unnerved her for weeks afterward. "They weren't dead," she said. "They were awake in a way I still don't understand." Back in her cell, Lynn kept one hidden possession, a small folded paper beneath her pillow. On it were words she had never shown anyone. I didn't want to be Lynn. Lynn was armor. Lynn didn't feel shame. Lynn didn't need comfort. But Lynn was a cage I built to escape another one. I was never trying to be evil. I was just trying not to disappear. Some nights, she read it until the pencil marks blurred. She thought of the girl she used to be. She thought of the victims, the wives, the children affected by her choices. She thought of the life she could have lived if one man, Kevin Hartley, hadn't destroyed her trust with a single cruel laugh. And she wondered which version of herself would survive longer. Lynn, or the strange shadow the world insisted on calling Scarlet Widow. As dawn crept through the narrow window and footsteps approached for morning count, Lynn whispered the only truth she could hold on to. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just hope someone remembers I was here."